Well, welcome back for our final panel discussion before our dinner tonight, which will be out at the hotel, and it will be at the Embassy Suites. We simply could not hold all of you in our venues that we have right now. And again, let me say, I'm told now that the number over in Hamburg Hall is up to 700. They're about to outnumber the audience in this hall, and we thank them again for their patience in joining us in this special way, but we are very glad that they've not had to miss a moment of this incredible program that we've all experienced together today. This final panel is focused on the teaching of constitutional history in the 21st century university. How do we teach early American history? How do we teach the history of the Constitution? And certainly we need to teach it. And I would share with you that a few years ago, a National Alumni Council did a study of knowledge of the Constitution and knowledge of early American history in universities around the country. I remember one particular study, which was made only of Ivy League students in the Ivy League universities. They asked the question, who was the commander of American forces in the Revolutionary War? 25% of the students at Harvard, Yale, Brown, Princeton, etc., could not answer that question. 25% of the seniors at those Ivy League institutions. They then asked the question, can the President of the United States, anytime he or she wants to do so, totally suspend the Bill of Rights at will? 30% of the Ivy League's seniors answered yes, the president could suspend the Bill of Rights anytime the president decided to do so. And of course, you'll all remember when we think about our history, not of the colonial period, but the recent study of high school graduates in the country in which 50% thought we fought on the side of Nazi Germany in World War II. So the knowledge of our own history, or I might say the lack of knowledge of our own history, is very alarming. And it's often been said that students do not learn what teachers do not teach, and they do not understand the readings that are not assigned to them and that they never see. And it is, to me, alarming that only 8% of the colleges and universities, both public and private, in the United States today require a single course in American history or American government to receive a diploma from that university. Somehow that misses, we heard at lunch a discussion of the well-educated person, and somehow that does not meet my definition of what the well-educated person is. And that's why we have continued to try to focus so sharply at this university on providing our students with an education about their own past and about the governing document of this country so that they can be informed, participating citizens. So that's the subject of this discussion. And how should it be taught? Should it be taught differently than it was 50 years ago or a century ago? And I can't think of anyone better to lead this discussion than the person that I would call America's community moderator. She's an extraordinary person. Each week, more than 2.3 million listeners across the country tune in to the Diane Rehm Show, which has grown from a local morning call-in show, which I well remember in her earlier years. She was even desperate enough to have me on, into one of the nation's premier radio programs. The show was named to the top 10 list of the most powerful programs in public radio, based on its ability to draw listeners to public radio stations. It's the only live call-in talk show on this list. It's known for the range of subjects that it covers. It's known for the objectivity of the program and the manner in which it is presented. Ms. Rehm's topics range from Iraq to the U.S. economy to the art of landscape design and James Joyce's Ulysses. She has interviewed a majority of the members of this panel of historians on her programs from time to time. And particularly, listeners call the show to participate in what they call a civil exchange of ideas, and how badly our country needs a civil exchange of ideas. She became the first radio talk show host to interview a sitting president in the Oval Office, and in 2010, Diane Rehm won a Peabody Award for her more than 30 years in public broadcasting. She's been with us before to lead discussions with our students, and it's a great honor to have her back on campus to moderate this discussion with our guests. Diane Rehm.
You know, I think we should begin by thanking David Boren for this extraordinary day. As I understand it, he simply picks up the phone and says to David McCullough, "Come out to the University of Oklahoma. We need you to do this for Akil Omar or any of these wonderful minds sitting here on the stage." As David has said, our focus is teaching the U.S. constitutional history in the 21st century. I love Akil's story of having his 6-year-old learn the names of the presidents. We had our son do exactly the same thing. It's a great way to start. I also loved his idea of having each one of us go to Wikipedia to look through the names of each of our presidents to learn one fact about each of those. I find myself thinking that we are faced with a group of constitutional scholars who adore what they do, adore the Constitution, all of its inclusions, all of everything that was left out from most of us. At least I speak for myself. Growing up in high school, if somebody mentioned learning about the Constitution, it was a big yawn. So we are now here in the 21st century where there's a great deal of talk of exporting democracy, exporting the sense of freedom that this country has developed over these 225 years, and yet here we are learning today from scholars, but perhaps not knowing very much ourselves. So I start with each of you, asking you, considering the fact that you are so excited about your topic, what has happened to the interest in learning about the Constitution? Where have we as adults, where have professors, where have teachers somehow fallen down on the job, and how can we, in the 21st century, make it something exciting? I'm going to start with a person you've not yet heard from, but will hear from this evening, at dinner, and that's David McCullough.
Thank you very much. History is human. 3 words, and I sincerely believe that that is the essence of teaching history and of understanding history. And I also believe firmly that our teachers are the most important people in our society. They are doing the work.
Me too.
So I do not blame our teachers, and I object to anything that is proposed or enacted or becomes acceptable socially that makes the difficulties of teaching greater still. We should be doing everything we can to support our teachers and to give them our appreciation for what they do. I think that history and a love of history and understanding of history begins truly, literally at home. I think if there's a problem with education today in the country, it's with us, we who are fathers, mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers.
Peter Onuf, how would you
If I were teaching a course, a high school course, in the Constitution, I would begin by stressing that the very presence of George Washington at the Constitutional Convention was a major reason for why it succeeded. And yet he said very little. Why was that? You have to understand that. The Constitution Center in Philadelphia, which was a huge undertaking, is in very serious trouble. Attendance is not good. They really are struggling. And they made it kind of a huge electronic game show fair. I don't think that's the way to do it. It's about people. You have to understand those human beings. And I think that's true about teaching any aspect of history, American history or any history.
Peter Onuf?
Well, I'll pick up on that, David. That makes a lot of sense to me, the humanity of the founders and identifying with what they did. I'd say there are a couple of problems that explain the dire state of constitutional studies. One is they have been dominated by lawyers, and we need to take it back from the lawyers. And I think Akhil is going to agree with me. And it also is something that we set aside when I was a boy and when many of you were in school as civics. And this was the stuff that was so boring. It's because it wasn't part of our history. I think we need to take it back into history, and historians have their share of blame here too, in that very few of us have focused on the founding. Now, I blame Gordon Wood for that because his book was so great that nobody bothered to study the subject anymore. So I think we've broken through, and there's actually a very lively constitutional scholarship that hasn't made it to the schools yet. I would just pick up on something that Akhil said earlier. The first thing to say is everybody knows we live in an interconnected world now. We need to think about the Constitution in its own time in a world context, and that is what's happening geostrategically, geopolitically. War explains a lot. It explained in Akhil's talk. He talks about 1776, a state of war, that moment of origins. I think we need to recover a sense of the contingency and of the failures of the founders in order to make it come alive so that we can relate to our world in a way that we begin to understand they related to their world. So I think it's something that historians can do, and that it takes, alas, generations for these things to trickle down. Maybe the internet's going to make it faster. But I think the new way of thinking globally about the generation of the founders and the challenges they faced abroad and at home, the threat of war with each other, the threat of war in the larger world, the reality of war. The American Revolution is a 50-year period of war in the world. That's what frames everything from 1765 through 1815, and we could say beyond. The Civil War is yet another episode in that history of wars. So I think you can make it compelling. Kids love war. Well, we began in war. And it's in that context that I think we can begin to recover what these human beings did, their great achievements, their great failures.
All right, I'll turn to Kyle Harper, who is director of the Institute for American Constitutional Heritage. Tell me your approach.
Well, I think one of the exciting things about teaching college is that you're teaching adults, and you're teaching kids who are becoming adults. And you're not just teaching them facts. You're not just asking them to memorize when an amendment was ratified or... you're not just teaching them facts. You're actually also teaching them to become citizens. And I think if you embed practices of citizenship inside the classroom, that you can not only achieve greater results in your teaching, but you can actually excite them and engage them to take what they learn inside the classroom into their lives as citizens. And so, to me, that means creating situations for debate and civil discussion in ways that make them realize that these facts on a page actually influence and deeply impact their political lives. And so whether it's religious freedom or privacy, whatever it is, these are issues with a history. And history actually matters, particularly when it comes to the Constitution, in a way that profoundly will shape the world that they live in. And so giving them a chance not just to learn that, but to engage with that and to recognize, to make it come alive because they realize that it shapes their lives and ask them to develop their voice is a way that I think we can do in the 21st century. It isn't just lecturing at them, but it's asking them to develop their voice as citizens inside the classroom and then take it outside the classroom.
Akil Amar, do you begin by showing them what was left out?
Well, there's so many, from my 6-year-old...
Can you hold that microphone?
Them, from my 6-year-old to my undergraduates to my law students, there's sort of different audiences, or when I get out to meet ordinary folks. Here's my multi-pronged approach, and it's very autobiographical. So my parents, when I was a young boy, take me to Mount Vernon and to the White House and to the Congress, to the Capitol building and to Independence Hall, and that just wowed me. And then my teachers had role play exercises where, it's 1850 and you're Henry Clay and you're Daniel Webster, and that was kind of cool. And I read storybooks, history books, books of the sort that David McCullough writes for ordinary, non-scholarly audience, full of immaculate scholarship, but just accessible to ordinary people because he is explaining. And then I get to college and I read Gordon Wood's work, and so here's now taking that's autobiographical. That's how I got into this. I do think the National Constitution Center is a great public space, and I really got to know Gordon when he was the founder, really, of the academic
So you
board.
start very young, but let's say you didn't have such parents. Let's say you get to college and you are required to take a course on the history of the Constitution. I am required to take that course. How do you engage me immediately?
I think it's actually a little late to start then. So I think politics is sport. I think it can be fun. And if you can know all about the football team and your favorite baseball team, you can, actually follow politics, which is very interesting, and know your presidents. And every July 4th, I think we actually need materials, kid-friendly, family-friendly materials, like a secular Seder, like idea that, we have to have occasion, our calendar is built so there are these occasions for remembrance. We call them Memorial Day and Flag Day and Constitution Day and July 4th and Veterans Day, and we're not using, and President's Day as sort of proper occasions to just come up with materials so that families.
There are too many sales out there, and that's the problem.
But this can be fun, and it can be like little teams, little, the competitions even, because kids like to compete too on knowing your Constitution, knowing the founders, knowing politics. It can be fun. It's like following sports teams.
Rosemarie, fun?
Fun? Well, what always strikes me is that most people know at least a little bit about the Declaration of Independence, but very little substantively about the Constitution. And I say, well, that's the sexy document. That's the document that has the grand abstract principles. And the Constitution is, as you said, the boring document because it's all about structures and processes and institutions. And unfortunately, what most people don't understand is that that Declaration of Independence would have been a dead letter, at least after the War for Independence was over, if there hadn't been a Constitution. So what I try to do in my teaching is try and restore some of what Peter mentioned, the contingency that this young United States would have fallen apart. There would have been no United States after 1787 or 89 or 90 if there hadn't been a Constitution. That James Madison himself thought that the Constitution would fail when he left Philadelphia in 1787 because they didn't pass one of the most crucial provisions he put in there, a veto by the Congress on state laws, the ability of Congress to veto state laws. And I think some of the things that Akil said about the ratification process and how it was a nationwide debate, a kind of referendum about the Constitution, that can restore, at least to people who I am able to get in my classes, I think, some of the excitement about what it meant at the time, and I would hope that that would carry over to an understanding that we are the people today, and without paying attention to that Constitution, it may not be there. And I think we've been a victim of the success of the Constitution. It's been, as one historian once said, a machine that goes of itself. And we have had the luxury as a people to just sit back, somewhat ignorant of the structures of government, and let the processes of government go along with deciding to we may or may not vote at any given election. And again, voting was seen as this incredible privilege. It was incredible when people got the vote and that there would be universal male suffrage. That was a big radical innovation. But we've lost that. We've lost that sense of the excitement, the innovation.
Gordon Woods.
Well, I think the historians are, in part, responsible for the neglect of the Constitution, at least at the university level, college level. I think people here at OU are very fortunate. You don't realize that throughout the country, most undergraduate schools do not have courses on the Constitution and haven't had them for at least a half century. I'll give you one fact that it may be wrong, but it's my impression. The William and Mary Quarterly is the leading journal in early American history. Over the past 40 years, until last October, there was not a single article published. It comes out 4 times a year. Not a single article on constitutional history. The beginnings of the Constitution, on the constitutional issues involved in the imperial crisis, nothing. Until October of this last year, and I think that's a kind of straw in the wind. We have to understand that historical interpretation goes in fashions. And over the last half century, there have been other issues that have preoccupied the historical profession. Issues of race, issues of women, legitimate issues that have preoccupied graduate training and the writing of history in graduate schools and in undergraduate schools. Now, at the law schools, constitutional history has been continued, and it's always there. But I'm talking about the undergraduate schools that simply neglected that. But I think changes are coming. Fashions change. Some of the other older issues have become tired, and young people are looking for new issues. I think this article that appeared in the October issue of the William and Mary Quarterly was a kind of indication of a new era emerging in scholarship.
David Fisher.
I find that history teaching and history learning is alive and well and flourishing in thousands of classrooms around the country. It's not so flourishing in other classrooms. And we might ask what works and what doesn't, to meet and talk to the incredibly creative, often young teachers in elementary school, in high school especially, is to be inspired by the possibilities. I think there are more troubles in the colleges for reasons that Gordon just described. But what seems to me to work, if we're talking first of all about very young children, is something that awakens a sense that others have walked this earth before them. Something that also triggers an exercise in the imagination. And there are lots of ways of doing that. Taking them there, telling them stories. Kids love stories that way. Then in classes beyond that, it's a question of, I think, getting them embarked on inquiries that are meaningful to them from the very start. Framing questions that speak to their condition as well as to others around them. And then it keeps growing from there. I think other things got in the way that you described. We lost that sense of individual agency in a lot of academic history. We lost the stories. We lost the events. And now they're all coming back at a great rate. And I would be very hopeful for things
I'm glad.
ahead.
I want to remind you all, please hold those microphones very close so that everyone can hear you. And when you turn to talk to your fellow panelists, take your microphone with you.
Apologies.
Okay. Peter, this morning you talked very vividly and dramatically about the dead hands of history. I find myself wondering about the very live hands of politics and to what extent politics is now beginning to undermine our sense of this gorgeous document with all its failings, how politics is intervening in what we thought we had as a constitutional democracy.
Right. Well, Diane, I think the big problem is that people invoke the Constitution, but they don't understand it. It becomes sacred scripture, and it's supposed to be perfect. I think it's radically disabling for us to fetishize or to worship the Constitution. I think it's quite a different thing to appreciate the achievement and to sense how they thought about future generations. I think that should be a model. I think we need, in this way, I would adopt the Jeffersonian idea of generational stewardship, that we need to be concerned about the coming generations. This idea of Martians have to come before we can think in terms of world government or a real crisis before. Well, if we do think of the next generation as not just extensions of us, but people that we have a trust that we have to fulfill toward them, it's going to be their world. How do we leave it? I don't think we're thinking collectively in those terms. So I really think it's time for us to think generationally, and I will invoke the spirit of Jefferson. And in this way, I think we can think beyond the kind of partisan politics, because this involves collective activity. This involves the commons. This involves things that we share. I think that's the crucial lesson of the founding. It's not that we need to say, hands off the Constitution, it's perfect, they were divinely inspired. But there is something, and I think Akil put it brilliantly when he talked about this big democratic bang that took place. I think that's something that's up to us to cherish the legacy of that bang, to keep it alive, to keep the light bright, and understand the way to cherish it is not by making believe that we are them, and that we can channel them. They want us to look forward. So that would be my response.
David Woods.
You're supposed to respond to that, David.
Did I say something wrong? David Fisher.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
It's also the
Forgive me.
ears as well as the microphone.
Forgive me. My fault.
I would, one thought that comes to me is I wouldn't start with the Constitution with students. We find in trying to find a better way than our survey, which was losing students very rapidly, to substitute 3 semester courses for 2, and each centered on one event: the Revolution, Civil War, World War II. Each covered 100 years. The students loved it. They were invited to get into this history in terms of individual experiences, often linked to their own experience. It was easy for World War II. They interviewed the members of their family. They said, "I'd never talked to my grandfather before." And they came away with a sense of intimate involvement in very large processes. And I think after that, then into the more complex and abstract questions, such as the Constitution, could follow from that.
Gordon Woods.
Well, I'm not sure how to design a course on the Constitution. I've never done that. I teach history, and the Constitution is part of that history. I teach a course on the Revolutionary Era, and the Constitution is the climax of that course. Your question, Diane, was politics. How does contemporary politics or politics in general? I'm reminded of Rebecca West's statement. She said, "When politics comes in the door, truth goes out the window." There is a problem. There is a problem with politics, especially democratic politics, because, and we all sense this, there's a lack of honesty on the part of the politicians. And why should that be so? That's because if they say something true, they're apt to get punished. So in the end, the problem is us, the American people. And when Pogo was right, we've met the enemy, it is us. We punish our politicians for gaffes, for mistakes, for telling the truth. So disingenuousness runs rampant throughout our political system. It's an embarrassment for a democratic polity to force our politicians to be disingenuous, to not be honest. And yet, do we want them honest? That's the question. So I think there's a real difficulty that we have to face as a democratic people, to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, are we encouraging our political leaders to be what they ought to be? Jefferson, Washington, Madison could not have survived in our political environment. They simply could not have been what they were and still survive. So democracy, we pay a price for it. And so we should be aware of that price, and we should be careful about how we put our democracy together. It's not an easy task, and I think I just, when I look at what political leaders have to go through, it's amazing that we have as many men and women willing to engage in political life. They pay an awfully high price, and the worst is the disingenuousness that we impose on them.